I thought this small stone church was a great subject to explore drawing various textures. And by textures, I mean the way the surface of an object appears. Whether in fact it's super shiny and smooth, or whether it's a jagged surface, whether it's a rippled surface, whether it's uneven, whether it's somehow chunky, whether it's spiky all over, whatever it is, exploring how we create a sense of realism and how we draw something that can actually be very complex and not have it either look strange, or even if we draw it exactly, to have it overwhelm visually our drawing so that all we see is the texture and not the actual object. Now, with this scene, we have a number of significant surface textures to think about. The most obvious one is the stone wall that we have in front of us. There's the slate tiles on the roof, and there's the various shrubby foliage in the foreground. And then there's also that large tree in the background, which has a very different surface texture to the low plants we have in the front. So you can see how I'm starting this freehand ink drawing. I'm using a 0.2 millimeter pen. That angle's not quite right. I'll just change it a little bit. Checking my angles, checking alignment, looking to see where various points I'm about to draw line up in the reference with parts I've already drawn, and then I find that corresponding point in my drawing. Usually I look visually first to see, does it look right, does it feel right, and then I add those lines on. Now, probably the most important thing at this stage in the demo is for you to notice what relatively light lines I'm drawing. This is a building. The fundamental mark that we want to use in creating the appearance of the building at this stage is going to be line. But equally, because we want to take the surface textures into account, we want to keep our lines light and possibly even a little bit, well, not very solid, even having slight gaps in sections in our lines, so that we can create various effects to create the surface textures that we see. The most important thing to remember when we think of textures is not to think of it as being pattern. And I see a lot of drawings where I think this mistake has happened, that when people think, now how do I draw this texture? What they're actually thinking is, what pattern can I use to put all over this object that creates the feel of this object? And in the end, patterns end up becoming very wooden and stilted and give a very flat two-dimensional look. I find a far more helpful way to think of it is to say, when I look at this surface, what's the effect I see in relation to the overall scene? Now, that includes the texture, if you like. It includes the way the surface may be shaped or formed and the way it catches the sun or the shadows and so forth. But it also includes the sides, the edges, the angles, which may or may not have their own discernible texture, if you like. And I want to find marks that I can put on my drawing that capture everything effectively and in balance. So if the individual blocks of stone on this church are something that we see relatively easily in our reference, then we want them to be relatively easy to see in our drawing. But if they don't visually overwhelm what we see in our reference, we don't want them to visually overwhelm our drawing so that we can't see the church for the stone blocks, every one of them so carefully drawn. And now going down the side, checking the angles. Generally, I'm happy with the proportions of this church. I think at the end, when I looked at my drawing and critiqued it, as I always recommend doing so that we have a focus on our next drawing, I think the two biggest issues with it were the church doorway is too large, it goes up too high, and I realised that as soon as I did it, I could have started again, but I'm always saying resist the urge to just push through it and bear it in mind for next time. So I thought I'd do what I keep saying. And I think the 3 side windows end up, when they're finished, feeling larger than they feel on the wall in the reference. And now in front, we have these small bushes that they could be lavender bushes at the moment that aren't yet flowering, since we're in the middle of winter in Australia at the moment. Now at the very start, I actually drew a straight line, or a series of small straight lines and dotted lines in a straight line across the centre of the building, and it lined up pretty exactly in the reference with one of the courses of stonework as being the position of eye level. And it's because, in fact, it does form this horizontal line across all of the mortar work at one point in the building that we know that this is eye level, that we have a horizontal line there. And above that, the lines angle one way, and below that, they angle the other way. So I'm trying to align my courses of stone with that. You might have noticed I put dots down the closest corner to help me just work out where these courses were going to end on the wall, so I could get the angle as helpfully correct as possible. The challenge of drawing any indication of brickwork or stonework where it's in even rows is that we have to match the perspective angles for that horizontal section of the building. And that, even with a lot of experience drawing a lot of perspective angles, is not necessarily a straightforward thing. We certainly need to keep our wits about us. And so I'm trying to create a feeling of stone blocks. And part of that feeling means that I don't want lots of smooth straight lines and lots of sharp right angles where the corners of the stones are and where they come up against other stones, because that is not the feel that we get when we look at this stone church, because the blocks are not perfectly exactly laser cut, right angled, sharp edges, sharp corners, sharp points. But they have a certain roundedness to all of their edges and their corners. And they also have a certain texture on their surface, both reflecting the fact that these are a natural product, but also that they've been there for probably 160, 180 years, slowly eroding in the Sydney weather. And so we're trying to show in our coursework and in the way that the stones come together that sometimes there are slight shadows being caught because part of the stonework has eroded or part of the concrete has fallen out, and that creates an unevenness that's enough now to catch a little bit of darkness, a little bit of shade or shadow. And I'm also adding some hatching to represent the colour of some of these stones, because some of them are quite dark. Now here's a great little tip, great trick to know. Before I did too many, it's very good to look at our drawing and saying, is there any part that I'd like to be able to hide or disguise with these hatchings I'm going to put on it? And there were some parts in the spot between the first and second side windows where I got my angles wrong. And I ended up with that horrible dark line. But by now adding some hatching on it, or creating some blocks on it that I hatched, now it's not so obvious. So never despair. There are often ways we can creatively hide marks and lines that after we've placed them, we realise that they're not in the best place. So now some hatching for the shade and shadow inside the veranda, inside the porch area. And a bit more work on the stones. And although basically the stone blocks are fairly regular, some of where we would perhaps imagine one block would be, there might be 3 blocks or 4 blocks of smaller sizes and various compositions pushed in there. Now, we come to even perhaps the more troublesome texture of the surface of these low shrubby bushes, Because, well, how do we draw these? We know, in fact, or we possibly know anyway, that these are small stalks coming up from a central spot, covered in lots of very, very, very small leaves, and I dare say in spring some sort of flower, a lavender I suspect, comes up out of them. For now it's just the foliage, but how do we draw the intense detail of all these many small thin stems and their closely held leaves? And it's important to remember that I want to draw how they look. I want to draw the feel of them. I want to draw the effect, the visual effect we get when we see them, not to draw them exactly, not to draw the detail. And I find personally one of the most helpful ways to think about this is to look for the shadows, look for the values, look for where the lights and darks change, and use hatching to capture those lights and darks. But we don't just do it mindlessly. We keep looking at our reference because in many cases, those bushes that are closest to us will benefit from having sharper lines and darker hatching with the ones that are further away. And while the tree in the background is still a plant, I'm thinking of it in a very different way in terms of textures, in terms of the visual effect when we see it, because it looks very different to those close plants in the front. And so I'm going to use different marks, a different drawing technique, if you like, to draw it. And you can see that I'm just using simple vertical hatching, not too much. I don't want this too dark because I want it to feel like it's right in the background. And so a lighter value gives that impression more. You'll notice on the porch roof, which just looking at it proportionally, yes, comes out a bit too far, doesn't it? But the slate tiles, I've done actually straight lines. I've done the sort of lines that perhaps people might have more easily or more quickly done on the walls for that porch roof section. Because the visual effect, if we look at those tiles, is that they do line up in very straight lines. As long as we get the perspective angles correct in both directions, then that works rather well. So we're at the stage of a drawing where I think it really does help to sit back a little bit and to look back and forth and say, okay, am I getting the visual feel, the visual effect in my drawing that we have in the reference? It let me realize that I hadn't actually done the stained glass of those furthest two windows. But if you look again at those windows and the darkness I've put on them for the glass, you'll notice I'm trying to capture the effect of the stained glass without having to draw the detail of it, which of course I couldn't have made out anyway at this distance and this angle. But it's yet another, if you like, texture. But it's, in my thinking, it's a different effect, visual effect, to find marks that I can combine in some way to capture. And then there's a little bit of final adjustments, just darkening a few values down in this front left corner. And I think that's about it. When it comes to capturing the effect of textures, I always feel capturing the effect is a better way of thinking than trying to draw the textures, which can so easily end up being pattern, which in my mind ends up looking very wooden. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. But look, in the end, however you understand these subjects, these issues, and however your drawings are, and even whenever you end up thinking about them, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next video. Bye.